Thanks for tuning in to My Valley, His Victory, hosted by me, Mackenzie Smith, where I interview Christians who love the outdoors and have walked through valleys in their lives. In a world of highlight reels and surface-level relationships, we all have faced hardships. I believe our experiences can be encouraging to others if we have the courage to be vulnerable. 2 Corinthians 1 says, "The Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." My goal is to inspire you to come to the Creator through His creation and connect you with Christians who have been through similar experiences. I pray that this podcast encourages you if you are in a valley and pushes you to share how God has turned your past valley into His victory. On today's episode of My Valley, His Victory, we have Travis Mullen. He is a follower of Jesus who loves his wife and 3 boys. He loves sharing his love of creation with his family and friends through the outdoors. When he is not working in real estate investing, he's doing some of his many hobbies as a generalist. He loves hunting, fly fishing, hiking, and camping, and he's also an artist who makes hip-hop music, poetry, paintings, and other forms of visual art. He is also a real estate investor, brewer, and was a pastor for 16 years. Thanks so much for being with us today, Travis.
You're welcome. Thank you, Kenzie.
Absolutely. So I know I just shared with our listeners your bio, but why don't you go ahead and just share a little bit more about yourself and who you are?
All right. So I'm pretty big on my family, just hanging out with my wife and kids, do a lot of stuff as a family. Like Sunday was Mother's Day. We went up to a crazy old mining ghost town in Arizona called Jerome.
Ooh.
And that was very, very cool. And we got some these like old-fashioned, old-timey photos done on metal plates with this guy who just does that. It was really cool.
I love that.
Yeah, so I'm always doing stuff with my family, and then if not, I'm working or doing one of those many hobbies. So
yeah. So you said you're a real estate investor. How long have you been doing that? Because I know you said you were a pastor for 16 years.
Yeah, so about 7 years ago, I started doing this. I'm primarily like a loan originator with a company that deals with investors. And then I also learned a lot about investing from being in this business. So that's something that I'm somewhat passionate about now, for helping others like learn how to do that. Because I could have done a lot better as a pastor if I had known what to do with money and houses and stuff like that.
Very cool. And you guys live in Arizona, right?
Yes. We're in the northwest side of Phoenix, called Glendale.
Okay.
We're about 20 minutes from where the Cardinals play.
Okay. Very cool. And is that where you grew up?
Yes. I grew up in the Phoenix area, but I grew up in Scottsdale as a kid. And then I was out of state for about 17 years in California and Rhode Island.
Okay.
So
Very cool.
I moved back here 3 years ago. So it's been nice to be back in Arizona.
Okay. Wow. Polar different places. You go to one of the biggest states to one of the smallest states.
Yeah, literally.
Rhode Island. What, I don't know a thing about Rhode Island. What is even up there?
It's a small New England state where this main city's Providence. The whole state has a population of 1 million. So that's like the whole state of Montana or Wyoming has 1 million, but Rhode Island has it in this tiny little state. So it's very populated and very beautiful, like a lot of summer beach, a lot of coastline.
Okay.
So it has a really nice New England coastline beachy vibe. Yeah, the city of Providence, very artsy. That was something that we loved about it.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, New England's a different animal, though, than everywhere else.
Yeah, you've kind of dipped your toes in a little bit of polar opposites, so love that. So talk to us a little bit about your outdoor hobbies and kind of how you got started in those and kind of just what you like about them.
Yeah, so as a kid, it was just kind of normal, like what my dad would take me to do, and my brother, and not really my sister. She was like 6 years younger, but my brother and I would do fly fishing, and he'd take us hunting, like dove hunting and quail hunting as kids. And then sometimes we'd the big privilege would be to go like on his big elk hunt or a deer hunt. But mostly it was like small birds, bird hunting or fishing. And then my dad didn't really hike, but they did buy a cabin when I was like 9 in the mountains of Arizona. And so there's a creek and a headwaters, like where it comes right out of the mountain. And we just love that place. So we would hike that creek. It's about a 5-mile hike. So as kids, we were doing a 5-mile hike and didn't even realize we were hiking. We were just trying to go to the headwaters.
Yeah.
And at the headwaters, you'd like refill your water bottles and canteens with fresh water out of the mountain. And it was really, I still take people there and just show them. It's like so amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we loved the outdoors there. And, I'd say my primary though was fly fishing growing up, and then adding some hunting. And then then my wife got into hiking, and I was happy because I love being outdoors. So we got more into hiking as a couple, but her also with some of her girlfriends that they've gained the name of the Wild Women. So they plan trips where they're gonna stay at an Airbnb or something and go hiking and do cool stuff. So that's been fun to watch. That's only the last few years that my wife got really into that.
Okay.
So now we're all geared up for backpacking, and we got to get more into it, but we still have little kids, so it's still hard.
Yeah, definitely. It's cool that she's kind of gotten more into the outdoors, and then now, you guys can kind of teach your kids that. How old are your kids?
My oldest is 17, and then I have two younger ones that are 8 and 6.
Okay. Very cool.
And they all love the outdoors. They've all been wanting to fish, wanting to hike, wanting to camp. So that's been a joy. It wasn't even hard. It wasn't a hard sell for them.
Yeah. I feel like for most kids, it's not. They just naturally are inclined to love the outdoors and love getting dirty and love whatever they can, whatever their parents can.
Bugs.
Yeah, bugs. Whatever their parents will let them do and kind of not have to micromanage them. I feel like, and the outdoors is a pretty safe place for that. So,
yeah.
Or at least your kids the younger two are getting to an age where you wouldn't have to like carry them in a backpack. And so, might be a good time to start teaching them, some of those skills now that they're able to walk and maybe carry a little backpack with them.
Yeah, that's actually this year is kind of the big year for my 8-year-old. He's about to turn 9, and I promised him at least a 2-night backpacking fly fishing trip. So
that'll be amazing.
We just have to identify which weekend we're doing that now.
That's so cool.
Because that was pretty much the age I started fly fishing. So that's kind of the logic of it.
I love taking backpacking and partnering it with something else like fishing. I think that's such a fun thing whenever you can kind of get 2 hobbies in at one time.
Yeah.
So growing up in Arizona and kind of getting to live in California and probably visiting a lot of other places, do you have a place in the outdoors that you just really love that keeps drawing you back?
Yeah, I'd say the landscape of Arizona, particularly the Mogollon Rim. Do you know what that is?
I believe I've camped up there.
Okay, so yeah, it's like this sort of like a sash across Arizona diagonally from kind of Sedona, Flagstaff down towards the White Mountains in the east. And it's like the largest ponderosa forest in the U.S. or maybe in the world, actually.
Is it near Pine, Arizona?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, that whole rim to me is like my favorite place, and there's certain creeks on it too. Like a lot of my fly fishing was like associated with that.
Okay.
That rim.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely beautiful.
And I actually have family history there too. Like my grandpa was a cowboy in Arizona, and he had locations along the rim that he knew and things he did in Prescott and a few other places in northern Arizona. So I feel like long time connected to these mountains, and my dad like lived and hunted and fished in them his whole life too. So
yeah,
it's kind of like a family history too, which is cool.
That's really cool. I love that, and love that it's not just like, oh, this really cool place that you just stumbled upon. It's like, no, my family's been coming here for years.
So it was actually an interesting thing is when you live in one place for most of your life and you do all your outdoors there, then you go to another state and it's like, I do not know how to access this state at all. Like, I don't know where to go. So in California, I don't think I even hunted once, and I was there for 12 years.
Yeah. And
I loved doing those hunts. They're kind of an annual tradition or rhythm. And then I did find a place to fly fish there, and it was really nice. And my buddies and I would go there frequently, and it was not frequently, but we kept going back to this one creek, and it was really nice. And then in Rhode Island, I had a few buddies who were fly fishing, and we didn't get very into it, but we discovered some of the creeks around there. So
yeah.
One of my favorite quotes about fly fishing is like a country song or a bluegrass song. And it says, trout don't live in ugly places. So that's what ends up making you love fly fishing. It's like, trout live in beautiful places, and it keeps drawing you into these amazing mountain creeks.
That's a good one, because that's so true. Yeah. I feel like everywhere there's trout is just absolutely stunning places.
Yeah, so. They like cold water, so they won't be like down in Phoenix, like where the lakes, that's for bass and crappie and all those fish.
Yeah, that's the kind of fishing that I'm used to doing. And so I've only fly fished a couple of times, but definitely need a lot of practice, because I am a bass fisher through and through, and totally different form, totally different skill set. It's like kind of forget everything you think you know about fishing when you go fly fishing, if you grew up doing the other things, you know?
Yeah.
So obviously we love the outdoors. It's really fun, beautiful places, but can you share with us kind of how the outdoors plays a role specifically in your relationship with Christ?
Yeah. So, one memory I have that kind of is where the connection, I think, might have been born, was at a youth camp in high school, or maybe junior high. And the leaders would tell us, like, hey, take your Bible and maybe a journal and go out in the woods and find a quiet place and, you know, pray and read and spend some quiet time alone with God. So it became like the law of quiet time, you know, in that culture of church. But I actually did it. And I remember I went up on this huge boulder that was like 12 feet tall, or maybe 15 feet tall, just gigantic. It was near Prescott. And there were some of these huge boulders out in the woods. And I just climbed up on one. And maybe as I was experiencing grounding a little bit, like I was connected to the earth through this boulder and praying and kind of like trying to really talk to God and really notice him in creation. And it was real. Like, it really happened. And ever since then, I just felt like that connection was very accessible and very real. And I do feel like creation makes me feel like there's no barrier, because normally I'm looking at a bunch of man-made stuff and it's just kind of like noise. So when I'm in nature, all that is stripped away and it's just me and God. And I just can't find anything better than that, really, for like connecting in prayer and just feeling one with God as creator.
Yeah, totally agree.
And even the element of danger, like animals and cold and heat, like all that stuff even plays into it, in the sense of like, this is how we were created in this world with all these primal dangers. And even that makes you feel like kind of more connected, you know, rather than synthetic worlds where everything is air conditioned and thought of, you know?
Yeah.
And safe. Everything's safe. You know, I think the danger of the natural world even somehow draws me into God also.
Yeah.
And you think of like rapids and all the fun, dangerous things you can do in creation. Like, there's something to that adrenaline too. Like, even last summer we went on our RV trip and I fly fished in Yellowstone, and I literally had to have bear spray on me. There are signs everywhere saying, do not venture into this park without bear spray. And I'm trying to fly fish, and I just keep thinking of a bear coming up behind me in the bushes, and it's just a crazy feeling, but I loved it.
Yeah, Yellowstone is not a place you want to venture very far without bear spray. That's like grizzly bear ecosystem in the lower 48. I know there are other places too, but that's where I think the majority of them are located. And I feel like that's where a lot of things happen. And especially if you're fishing and you happen to get a fish, that might draw the grizzly bears in even more than, you know, if you were just out hiking around or doing something. They're like, oh, I smell lunch. You brought me lunch. It's ready. Yeah.
And we stayed at a KOA in West Yellowstone. And the Monday I got back to work, I'm on my computer and I just look up news. Like, I look up news randomly around Yellowstone that day because we were just there. And it said that a woman was killed on this particular trailhead. I was so curious because it said West Yellowstone. I look up the trailhead and it was literally across the street from our KOA. So she went jogging the morning that we drove away and never came home because she was jogging by herself, and that's really dangerous in grizzly bear country.
Yep. Running and mountain biking are like the two most dangerous things you can do in bear country, because you can come up quickly without making a ton of noise and startle a bear. So.
And they also made it very clear in Yellowstone that if you're by yourself, you're way more vulnerable than if you're in a group.
Yeah.
Even two people's way better than one.
Yeah, because your voice can determine if you guys are having conversation or something, but you can kind of stealthily run up on something and scare it. And yeah, scary thoughts. So you obviously grew up in Arizona and in some really beautiful country, but could you give some practical advice to listeners who maybe don't live in a super outdoorsy area? Maybe they live in a big city like Phoenix, kind of ways that they can connect with God through the outdoors just in their everyday life.
Yeah, I've had to deal with that too, because where we lived in Rhode Island, we were in the middle of the city. So I had to think about that a lot, because for me it was hard to be in a city. Like we didn't even have a yard. So our yard was like a parking lot and sidewalk. So my son was like he was like 4 or 5, and he's playing mud puddles like in our little dirt patch of 8 feet out of our back door. So that was our yard. And so yeah, I ended up seeking out local, basically it's things like parks and refuges that are, some are in the cities and some are outside of the cities. And, anywhere where you can get a view or sit on some big rocks or get in some trees, I think nature is nature. So when you get just a little bit of that untouched ground outside of the concrete, you start to experience it. And even parks can be just restoring, I think, for the soul. I mean, I think that's why Central Park's such a big deal. People are obsessed with it. It's so beautiful, and it's in such a concrete jungle. It's kind of amazing how they preserved a part of nature. And, every city I've been in has done that to some degree. So I think just taking advantage of local things and appreciating them for what they are is one way. And then another way would be just getting out of town and then, go to beautiful things. But then another thing is just, if you do have some kind of a yard, it's like actually tend to it, with some plants and gardening, and we do that too. So I'm always interacting with nature, even in my yard, which for me is very also fulfilling.
Yeah. Start a little garden or something and watch it grow. Take care of it and watch it grow.
That's actually nature.
Yeah.
How seeds and plants work.
Yeah. Figure out a way to grow like one thing that you can use in your kitchen and learn how to steward that. And yeah, that's super cool. Well, thank you for sharing that.
No problem.
So switching gears a little bit into the title of this podcast, My Valley, His Victory, would love for you to share a season of wilderness or a valley that you experienced and just what God taught you or prepared you for in that season.
All right. So yeah, one of my biggest valleys would have been a season of life where I was in my late 20s into my early to mid 30s. I was at the height of my wanting to serve God and do anything for him, and ended up going to church plant in Rhode Island. So I raised all these funds and got support from my church and denomination and family and friends, and went there wholeheartedly and excited and everything. And, my mentor was like, don't go to Rhode Island. It's like the church graveyard. And I was like, well, that's why we need to go there. I'm like very naive and positive and fearless about it. And it ended up being very tough. And like the people were, not very kind of like what you've expressed about having, in the industry of outdoors equipment, not a very friendly towards Christian faith environment or culture. Rhode Island's definitely like that kind of on a macro level. There's churches there, but the general culture is just not interested and not friendly. So I came as a very friendly religious guy, to them, and I'm pretty smiley, and Rhode Islanders are not smiley. They're just kind of like stranger, red flag. And the culture is just not like that. Like if you go to Texas, people are like, hey, how are y'all doing? Everybody's friendly to strangers. In Rhode Island, they're skeptical of friendly strangers. So I was kind of like, I quickly became much more of a crusty New Englander by default, just to fit in. Don't make eye contact. Don't say hi. It's almost like how to be friendly in Rhode Island. So it was quite a culture shock. But yeah, so we were there for 5.5 years. In about year 3 or 4, it was like the crash of 08, 09, and 10. So churches were starting to like cut off funding to us, and friends and family were having to put things on pause because they didn't know what was happening. People were unable to make their mortgage payments. Like people were struggling like that. Those couple of years were really crazy in America. And so somebody that's having to do support raising, it was like the worst time to be doing that. And in my mindset that I had as a pastor, it was all about that. Like I didn't have plan B or another career that I was working on. I had been all in on that, like Bible college, seminary. So ultimately it became a lot of financial stress for my wife and I. And it was very painful. Like it wasn't just like, oh crap, money's tight right now. It was like, crap, we can't pay all of our bills. So we're kind of alternating things that we're paying so that it doesn't get too overdue. And that was painful. It got to the point where because I got a loss of income, lost a job. I did have a part-time job and then lost that during that time too. So it just became, and I had a kid. I had a 5-year-old, 4 or 5-year-old at the time during those like 2 years. And I had Christianese in my ears, like, oh, God will provide. That's something you and believe, but then you're in the situation where like you cannot pay your bills. So that became very challenging to my faith of what I believed. And things like, just a lot of things people will say. It's like, yeah, but what about when you're in this situation? How does that work or apply? And so it was pretty dark. I got pretty upset, kind of at God, kind of at the whole setup of how we were supposed to be church planting, and kind of at the city, being like very unfriendly towards Christianity, because our church plant was kind of like fledgling, like 25 people, not really getting anywhere financially, like where we could be sustainable at all. So that was kind of what was happening. And in my marriage, it was so stressful that like she mentioned the D word of divorce. Like, I can't take this. Like, we can't keep doing this for like another 2 years, like the way it's right now. Because I was kind of hanging on to like, oh, God will provide. And then a year later, it's like, God will provide, I think. So ultimately, like, God provides, but I do believe God provides, but I don't think it's always in the way that we think it has to happen. So I was stuck in this mindset that I had to do ministry and get my paycheck from that rather than just going and getting a full-time job to sustain the roughest economy, since the Great Depression. So it was kind of a mindset problem, really, more than God not providing. So that was kind of the deep pain of it all. And I think the financial stress is a real stress on a lot of people and a lot of marriages. And I think when you feel like a failure as a husband or a father, you can also feel like a depression or a shame. And I think I dealt with that a lot. And then on top of that, shame of like failed church plant or failed church planter. So I'd say that was probably my biggest valley in my life. All meanwhile, all these joys of like new fatherhood, mixed in, and being in a new city and there's snow at Christmas, and like there's all this good mixed in. And then so all that happened like 2009 through 12. We moved back to California in 2012, kind of as a relief. Like, we need relief. We're going to go back to some really great friends and a great place. And that turned out to be a really good decision. It worked out really well. But while we're still there in Rhode Island, feeling like a lot of failure feelings and a lot of shame of like, oh, we weren't cut out for it, or it didn't work out or whatever. It took me like 10 years to unpack like what happened. So ultimately what happened was the crash of '08, but I was in such a fixed mindset about like having to do ministry in a certain way and get paid for it that I couldn't find my way out of the situation. That's my interpretation now. But for about 10 years, I didn't know whose fault was it. My fault, God's fault, somebody's fault. Like, I couldn't understand what happened. It took literally 10 years to kind of translate it in hindsight and be like, wow, that was a crash of '08. Everyone thought they were losing their jobs, and everyone thought their retirement was going to disappear. And so all these funders, all the people that have money to fund you, are extremely upset and worried right now. So that was kind of what really happened. And then there was a point, the lowest point was like I was in a food stamps office, and I'm looking at people that are like living in real poverty. And I came from like Scottsdale growing up, and my dad was an entrepreneur. So I'm like, there was like mixed feelings of pride and class, like in that situation. Like, I don't belong here. Like, my dad would be so mad if he knew I was here, like that kind of thing. And he'd kind of tell me to stop church planting, just go get a job, like, and he's a Christian, but he just thought it wasn't, that practical at that point in time. So anyways, that was kind of the deepest valley. And out of that, it became like a very big passion of mine to figure out financial stability for the sake of the family, like holding a family together, because it's very stressful. And, we got into Dave Ramsey and got out of debt in 2017. And that was a great feeling and great accomplishment. And since then, I've done a lot of work in business that's been a lot more, lucrative than ministry. And meanwhile, keeping my heart in ministry and still doing stuff with my church and helping and serving. And that's kind of been I'm still available. Like I've been either a pastor, part-time pastor, or elder at different capacities. And that pain became kind of like, I don't want to get paid for it. I just want to do it. I just want to do ministry like for free and learn how to make money a different way. So that was kind of what happened to me. It's not like the right answer for everyone, but that was kind of what it did in my life, that whole experience.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that and for walking us through that season. You touched on a couple different things that I kind of want to go back to, but I would love to hear kind of just a little bit more about like the state of Rhode Island and why is that known as the church graveyard? Are they something else? Like kind of what goes on in Rhode Island that you think contributes to that, if you have an answer?
Yeah, good question. I think a few factors would be like, it is heavily Catholic. So coming from a Protestant church planter perspective, I needed to kind of win those people over if they were like ex-Catholics or whatever. I kind of feel differently now. I wouldn't feel like I have to like convert a Catholic, which I think when I was a kid, I would have thought that. I feel like there's more unity between the broader church, like Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, when they have Jesus as the savior and the way. We can be in a stronger agreement, with lesser things being disagreements. So it's heavily Catholic, but most people, because of that, my experience with a lot of Catholic institutions was like, it made people more turned off. Like a lot of my friends who went to Catholic high schools, they're like, would call themselves atheists because that's how they felt about it. Like they were not drawn in, they were pushed away. And, that's just some people's experiences. I know plenty of Catholics that are very into their faith too. So it's a mixed bag. So Catholicism is one of them. And then, just kind of people being like, I'm over it. The Catholic Church, I'm done. I'm done with religion overall, basically. It's kind of one of the sentiments. And then another is just, I think culturally just being a progressive culture where everything is all the most progressive values are at the forefront. So religion is so far from that they just can't even fathom that. Like that's so far from how we think. What are you even doing here? So I'd say those two things, like post-Catholic and then highly progressive political culture.
Okay. Yeah, I was just, whenever you said that, I was like, I don't want to know anything about Rhode Island, but I definitely, wouldn't have known that. And so I just think that is an interesting fact that stood out. And I was just curious what played a role in that. I see that kind of as, similar to Utah in that it's, mostly Mormon culture. And so you saying that it's mostly Catholic and people being pushed out of the Catholic Church. And I think that's a lot of what Utah is with Mormonism. And anyway, so that was what I was thinking of whenever I heard that.
I just remembered one thing I wanted to say about the Rhode Island experience was just the last 2 summers ago when we were back in Rhode Island, we were with our friends that were part of the church plant, and they're still our friends. Like, like 6 couples that we're now still really good friends with whenever we're in town. And there's one friend that throws a big 4th of July party, and we all get to see each other. And they blessed us so much 2 years ago. And 2 of them said this separately. They said, when are you coming back to Rhode Island? We haven't had that kind of community since the church plant. And I'm like, what? Like I had carried so much like failure and shame about it that like to them, it was the greatest success of community that they ever had. And that's really big to me now. Cause it's like, if we could have just seen the whole thing differently, like I got a full-time job and we just keep doing our community, the whole thing could have been a different story. But it's certain fixed mindsets of what it had to be and how I had to live to make it happen was preventing that. So, And the other couple said, ever since you guys left, we've just been trying to find that kind of community again, and we haven't found it yet. So I was just, and they're in great churches, like, but something we were all doing together was really special, and that makes it, that's a fruit that we couldn't see back then.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate it now.
Yeah. So kind of like on that note, would you say that was kind of the climax or peak of maybe like kind of having closure or having understanding of this season, and like maybe what God was trying to teach you or show you during that season?
Yeah, that was definitely like a piece of closure of like, it wasn't all bad. There was some actually really great good from it. And also, I mean, there's actual people that are Christians because of it. Good friends of ours, and my wife's brother kind of came to faith through that time. And so there's these little fruits that are just like amazing. They're just not the kind of fruits, 150 person church, like the books I was reading back then,
Yeah.
Of success. So, and then what God was trying to teach me was like, you're not the main character of the story, Travis. You're just a supporting actor. I'm the main character. Like when you're trying to do a ministry like that, start up by yourself, me and my wife, and it's a little narcissistic. Like you think it's all on you. You think it's about you. You think it's like about whether or not you can do this. And by default, like you can't really get away from that. They assess you, church planting and pastors, they assess them. So it's like people are making judgments that this will work, So there's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And it plays a lot on your psyche. So you asked, what did I learn? I know one of the big things that my wife helped me realize was my whole identity was kind of wrapped up in this pastor word or church planter word, instead of just, beloved son of God or child of God. It was all wrapped up in these roles and jobs, instead of just who I am at my core as a person. So that's been a huge unraveling since then, was becoming a person and not a leader, like just how to be a person.
Yeah.
With or without the leadership titles, but not having your identity attached to leadership titles.
Right. No, I think that's good. And I think that ministry, yes, now is a vocation, but like, back in the Bible, it was, just something that people did. Obviously you had the Pharisees and the church leaders, but, I think that, now, we do need those pastors and those leaders, but really we just need people that are willing to show the character of God and who are willing to, walk alongside people and who are willing to share the gospel. And, I think that you did that, and, it may not have worked out. And I know you said that there was a lot of, failure and shame and wrapped up in that season. But I think that from a different perspective, there was none of that. Like, you're doing what the Lord has called you to do. Therefore, like, there is not failure, right? Like,
yeah, monetarily,
yes. Like, let's not make light of that. But I think just with a different perspective, it's like, no, you're winning, like for the kingdom of God, like you're winning, and you went out there, you shared the gospel with people, you brought people closer to Jesus. And yeah, I just think that's such an accomplishment with or without, the title of that. And like I said, I know that there's failure wrapped up in that, but I think that it's so cool that you've taken that season and the struggles and the financial struggles of that, and now you're using your story to help people, but also still doing ministry. So, you're learning from what you went through and the financial struggles, and now you're teaching other people how to be financially secure and hopefully not allowing something like this to happen to somebody else. Although it was the crash of '08, right? Like nobody could prepare or foresee that happening, kind of like COVID, like nobody saw that happening.
Yeah.
And so it's not really something you can prepare for, but
it's hard now. Cause if I do try to talk to a pastor or a church planter about not having their whole identity and finances wrapped up in their thing, it's hard for them to hear it. Just like it was hard for me to hear it back then.
Yeah.
So even now when I try to teach someone, it doesn't really go very far, because the whole construct of how we do things is kind of wrapped up in a certain way, way of doing things. So that's kind of a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's hard because we have gotten to a place where, ministry can be financially beneficial, right? Like we all know people in ministry that are very successful and making a lot of money doing it. And so it's like, how do you navigate that properly and really make sure that you're doing it with the right intentions and not getting wrapped up in the money piece of it, because it can be lucrative, but it can also go the opposite way, right?
Yeah.
As we're hearing. And so I think it's a scary role, for anybody going into ministry and full-time ministry with kind of doing their own thing, because it can be detrimental one way or another, whether you do it and it doesn't work out, or you do it and it ends up going really well. Then you have to really, be in a good place mentally, and what's the right word? And really steward that well and not let it grasp you. Because we see all of these like mega pastors fall and they get caught up in it. And so if you're listening, ministry is a great place, but it can also be a very scary place.
Yeah.
With lots of attacks from the enemy, because if you're out there doing what God wants you to do, you're on the front lines, right?
Yeah. And something else that became very natural there was being an outsider. So I had not lived in the city. So I was like new to the city life. I was from suburbs, which is different. It's slightly different, but also like we were a racial minority there. And I had never been a racial minority in my life. And then we became poor while we were there, and I had never really been poor. So that was pretty, like, God like shook up all my identities and taught me to navigate. And like, I had never been the minority religiously either. Like I had been around enough Christians where it didn't feel like I was the only guy. But in Providence, I joined a baseball team, and I was the only guy who even thought about faith at all. They were all like in punk bands that would rather make like a sacrilegious song than ever think about, so they were like all looking at me skeptical, and we all became friends, and a few of them I still talk to, and it's really cool friendship. Yeah. But I just felt like it was trippy when I was in this dugout with this baseball team. Like they were just, they're in metal bands that, kind of flip the finger to religion. And here I am, this guy like trying to plant a church and trying to be their friend. It was hilarious, but I'd learned to navigate it and just be like, actually be their friends. So it became kind of amazing. And now I feel so comfortable when I'm that kind of minority in a situation, like, racially in our neighborhood, it was mostly like Dominican and Puerto Rican and a lot of other countries. Actually, it was a very diverse part of town. So I got to know what that felt like. And it was pretty incredible span of experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd love to ask you, kind of just for somebody that's listening, a word of advice or a piece of encouragement, maybe around the aspect of this, of you thought that you were doing what God had called you to do. I think there's very, like you said, Christianese, God's going to provide, and he doesn't. Like, what do you do with that? And how do you not like lose your trust in God through that?
That's a good question. So even in it, I had a friend and mentor. He used to be my college pastor, and him and his family moved out to help us for a while he went to a seminary in Boston, but they lived in Providence by us so they could help us while they were there for like 2 years or a year. And even in the midst of that, like financial struggle, he goes, well, maybe we have to reinterpret what we mean by God providing. So boom, mic drop. He put it there, but I still couldn't interpret it for like 10 years. He said it right into the real time moment, but I couldn't answer his question, like how would we reinterpret what it means that God provides? I mean, we never went hungry or naked or unsheltered, we lived. So, I mean, we hold a lot of comforts in American culture. So maybe God's not as concerned about, every bill on our budget, like he's like, I'll get you through this. It'll be hard, but you're going to realize what things are actually necessary and what things are luxuries, things like that, where God is weaning us or pruning us. I did think of pruning a lot. Like God was pruning away character things, but also like expectations in life. Like, what do you think is necessary versus what is actually necessary? So, people in other countries, they don't feel like poor if they don't have $2,000, health insurance. They just don't have health insurance. They go to the doctor and they get a bill, and there's 20 or 30% of Americans that are even doing that. But I wasn't used to that, so I was like, then we ended up poor, and you get state health care in some states. So you just learn like a lot of things are not our idea of provision is not upper middle class American provision. That's not really what God's talking about with provision. I guess that's my answer.
Yeah.
Like, it might be painful. You might not like it. The answer.
Yeah. No, I like what.
Does that sound like a good answer?
It does. No, it does. It does. Because I think that we do have these like set expectations of like, I need to, or I'm just going to keep living the life that I'm living and God's going to provide. And it's like something in that life might not be God's will for your life. Therefore, he's not going to provide for it. And so, like what you're saying, if that's, your car payment or your, I don't know, health insurance or whatever the case may be, like if you, like you said, we never went naked, we never went hungry. I'm assuming never went without a roof over your head. Like that is provision. And like, period, the end,
yeah,
kind of thing.
If we could think of provision like that, then it's a lot easier to believe God provides.
Yeah.
But if we're holding God to our inflated budget, he may not provide for that.
Yep.
I think that's what I learned.
Yeah. No, I think that that's good. And I think we, seeing provision also in the people that are around you. I know that you talked about, having lots of good friends and having people provide in other ways, and maybe through prayer or through just something that they were providing spiritually in your life, like keeping your spiritual life alive whenever you were struggling, and having, this mentor, or having other people, like God sustaining you. It just may not be used to the way that you're used to being sustained. Yeah. And you might get squished a little bit.
Yeah. You might get beat up a little when you're getting pruned.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this, Travis, and just really appreciate you walking us through this really hard season. Is there anything else you want to add or anything you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
Just when it comes to like your podcast theme, just my favorite verse to think about like in nature is the be still and know that I am God, because nature's just so still. And it's like the best place to meditate on that. Yeah. So if any of you have never done that, go sit on a rock and think about, what is it, Psalm 46, 3 or something? That's a amazing concept, is just knowing that God is God and you get to be still. Like, you don't have to make anything happen. He's present and available all the time. Yeah. So, yeah. So good. All right, Travis. So for those listening who maybe want to connect with you or follow along, or you also have a podcast, where can they find you and all of that? Yeah, I have on Instagram, I'm Man Art Nation, and it's kind of like named after my art stuff. So Man Art Nation. And then I have a podcast called The Generalist Father. And actually, if any of you outdoorsy people have a lot of generalist, it's actually guys who are fathers. If any of you are into a lot of things and you're into the outdoors, that's the kind of people I want to interview for that. And then I'm starting a new podcast called Santos Locos, and that's about holy fools, like Christians who are weirdos, or people from the Christian tradition who are kind of outsiders or weirdos. Kind of like the guy who made Salvation Mountain in California. That guy was definitely weird, but he did an amazing thing, telling everyone God loves them. And so it's a podcast about that, and just kind of hosting people that are, people thought it was weird that I was a rapper and a pastor. I mean, that's kind of, to a lot of people, that's foolish. So, yeah. Hey, you just have a lot of hobbies, okay? Yeah, I do. So tell us real quick a little bit about your art and what medium, what can I expect to see? What are you doing over there? Yeah, so it actually connects with outdoors too. That's actually a cool story I was telling yesterday. At my church, we have a thing called the Creatives Collective, and it's like for creatives. So yesterday I was actually leading it, and I shared how my art, the way I came to my art was like off of a feeling, off of like Montana and Alaskan type scenes, like elk and wolves and grizzly bears and ravens on like a white background, like in the snow. A lot of the pictures were from Yellowstone or Alaska, and that's why I started painting. So if you look way back on my Man Art Nation, you'll find those kind of paintings. Or if you search the hashtag, you'll see bison and elk and wolves and stuff. And then more recently, and that was acrylic mostly. And then more recently, I've been doing oil paintings of people. And I'm working on about 13 or 14 of those right now. And
Okay.
they're not done. They're not done, but there's like a couple on my Instagram right now. One is a self-portrait and one is a guy I'm working on. And then, 13 others that will make their way to Instagram once they're done.
Very cool.
But
Can't wait to see them. I love it. Well, thank you again so much, Travis, for just sharing and being vulnerable and helping maybe somebody else that's going through a similar season see a little bit of light, or to see their situation a little bit differently and have a different perspective. And yeah, just thank you so much for being here and sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this podcast, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode of My Valley, His Victory. If you or someone you know are interested in being on this podcast, please email myvalleyhisvictory@gmail.com.